There's a particular kind of ownership that exists in a marriage where one person is taught that they have the right to take things from another person without asking permission. Not theft, exactly, not in the way the law would understand it, but a taking nonetheless. A taking of time, of labor, of resources, of the body itself. A taking that is so normalized, so integrated into the theology and the practice of marriage that the person doing the taking may never even understand it as taking. It is simply understood as their right. My name is Hannah. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. I married at 19 and left at 27. On this channel, I tell the stories that live behind closed farmhouse doors, and today I want to talk about what husbands in my community were allowed to take without asking, what this taking looked like, and what it meant to live as a person whose resources, whose time, whose very body could be claimed by another person at any moment. The first thing a husband was allowed to take without asking was his wife's labor. When I married Jonas, my time ceased to be my own. My labor belonged to him. My work, from the moment I woke up until the moment I went to bed, was understood to be in service of his household, his comfort, his needs. I did not have the right to decide how to spend my time. I did not have the right to say that I was tired and needed to rest. I did not have the right to pursue anything that was not directly related to maintaining his home and his children. What this meant, in practice, was that my time was available to be claimed. If Jonas needed me to do something, I was supposed to stop whatever I was doing and do what he needed. If he wanted me to manage a task that I had not expected, I was supposed to manage it. If he decided that I should do something differently, I was supposed to change how I was doing it. My time was not actually my own. It was his to use as he saw fit. I remember a specific afternoon when I was teaching my daughter to read. It was something I had begun doing because I believed it was important for her to learn, and I had created a small space and a small time each day where we worked together. Jonas came home and saw what we were doing. He told me that I should not be spending time on this. He said that my time should be spent on the household work, that teaching my daughter to read was something that could happen at other times, but that the household work was more important. He did not ask if I could stop. He simply stated what I should be doing, and I stopped. What was interesting about this, looking back, is that Jonas was not wrong, within the framework we had been given. Within the framework that said my time belonged to him, that my labor was his to direct, that my choices about how to spend my time were not actually my choices to make, he was simply exercising what he understood to be his right. He was taking my time because he had the right to take it. The second thing a husband was allowed to take without asking was his wife's resources. Any money that came into the household was understood to belong to him. Any inheritance I might receive belonged to him. Any gifts I received belonged to him. Any work I did that resulted in income belonged to him. I had no independent access to money. I had no ability to make financial decisions. I had no say in how resources were allocated. What this meant was that I could not buy something for myself without asking permission. I could not decide to spend money on something I wanted. I could not make a financial contribution to my own family. I could not save money for an emergency. Everything I might have wanted to do with money had to be approved by Jonas, and if he did not approve, it simply did not happen. I remember wanting to buy new shoes. My shoes were worn and uncomfortable, but I did not ask Jonas for money to replace them. I knew from the framework I had been given that asking would be asking him to spend money on something that was not essential, and that would be seen as wasteful. So I wore uncomfortable shoes, and I did not ask. This was the function of the system. The system did not require explicit denial. It required that I had already internalized the denial, that I had already decided not to ask, that I had already accepted that my wants did not matter enough to warrant the use of resources. The third thing a husband was allowed to take without asking was his wife's bodily autonomy, and this is perhaps the most consequential of the takings, because it goes to the most fundamental question of ownership. Does another person have the right to your body without your consent? In my community, the answer to that question was yes. A husband had the right to his wife's body. That right was theological. That right was assumed. That right was exercised without question or without asking. A husband could approach his wife for sexual intimacy at any time, and she was expected to be available. She was not expected to be willing. She was not expected to want it. She was expected to be available. And availability was understood as permission. What this meant was that my body was not my own. My body was something that could be taken from me. My body was something that existed for someone else's use. The question of whether I wanted what was happening was irrelevant. The question of whether I was in pain or uncomfortable was irrelevant. The question of whether I had just given birth or was grieving or was sick was irrelevant. The framework was simple. I was his wife. My body was his to use. I spent years not understanding this as a violation. I spent years understanding it as simply the way marriage worked. I spent years believing that my discomfort was my own weakness, that my desire not to be touched was my own failure, that my body's resistance was something I needed to overcome. It took years and significant therapy to understand that what was happening was not simply something I had to accept. It was a violation. The fourth thing a husband was allowed to take without asking was his wife's voice. Not in the sense that I was forbidden from speaking. I was permitted to speak, but I was not permitted to speak about certain things. I was not permitted to express disagreement. I was not permitted to say that I had a different opinion about something. I was not permitted to voice objections to his decisions. I was not permitted to speak about my own needs or my own desires. My voice was available to be used for certain purposes. I could speak to manage the household, I could speak to the children, I could speak to other women within certain boundaries, but I could not speak to advocate for myself, I could not speak to disagree with my husband, I could not speak to express what I actually thought or felt. My voice was his to direct or silence as he saw fit. What this taking of voice meant was that I became increasingly silent. I became someone who listened more than she spoke. I became someone who kept her thoughts to herself. I became someone who expressed agreement even when she disagreed. I became someone who had learned over years that her voice did not matter, and that the safest thing to do was to keep it quiet. After I left, I had to relearn how to speak. I had to relearn that I had a voice and that my voice had value. I had to relearn that I was allowed to disagree, allowed to object, allowed to say what I actually thought and felt. And I had to process the years of silence, the years of keeping my voice contained, the years of believing that what I thought did not matter. The fifth thing a husband was allowed to take without asking was his wife's sense of self. Over the course of years, through the taking of time, resources, body, and voice, a woman's sense of herself as a person begins to dissolve. She becomes increasingly defined only in relation to the people around her. She is a wife, she is a mother, she is a servant, but she ceases to be herself. She ceases to have an identity separate from her function. She ceases to understand herself as a person with her own wants and needs and desires. What I did not understand while I was living in this situation was that all of these takings were connected, that they worked together to ensure that a woman would become smaller, quieter, less present in her own life, that the system was designed to take from her everything that made her a person with agency and choice and power. After I left, I had to rebuild myself. I had to remember who I was when I was not defined by what I did for other people. I had to remember what I wanted when I had been taught that my wants did not matter. I had to remember that I had a voice when I had spent years learning to be silent. I had to remember that my body belonged to me when I had been taught that it belonged to someone else. What I understand now is that these takings are not accidental. They are not simply the way marriage works. They are the mechanism of a system designed to keep one person in power and another person in subjection. They are the method by which a person is stripped of agency, autonomy, and self. If you are in a situation where a husband is taking your time, your resources, your body, your voice, yourself, I see you. I see what is being taken from you. I see that it is not fair. I see that it is not right. I see that you deserve to have these things be yours, to have your time be your own, to have your resources be yours to decide about, to have your body be yours to consent to or refuse, to have your voice be yours to use, to have yourself be yours to define. What is being taken from you without asking is being taken as a form of control. And control is not love. Control is the opposite of love. And you deserve something different. This is my story. If it stayed with you, tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want to keep hearing the truth from behind the prayer cap.